am 11 years old, and the image of the colossal squid soothes me in my isolation. It moves silently through the depths, impossibly and breathtakingly vast, entirely independent, a self-actualized mystery to mankind. Its sweeping tentacles slice through the water as it glides onward towards an unknown destination. I sit in the dusty stationery closet down the hall from the class I should theoretically be attending. I clench my teeth and shut my eyes tight, trying to ward off the intruding disgust I feel at the mere presence of the millions of inferior beings that swarm the earth. What feels like thousands of contradicting notions and feelings attack my fragile mind from all sides, building up an overwhelming ringing pressure. Tears fall in a silent cry for help to my monumental Herculean squid god. I can see it clearly before me in the buzzing, pulsating light filtered through my closed eyelids. The colossal squid understands me. It both loves and watches over me while not even noticing my existence under its eldritch mass. I wrap my arms around my knees and hug them tightly to my chest. I know I'm bad. I know I'm wrong. The way my mind works is precisely the way a good person's mind should not. I am destined to hurt people, or to be sad and alone, and I can't bring myself to feel anything about this fact. I am nothing. I am a useless stain on this earth, causing only misery. My joy will forever come at the cost of others, and I know I'm meant to care. I am nothing, and yet the parasitic whisper in the back of my mind is steadily growing to an incessant shout and then a deafening screech, blinding me to all rationality, drowning out all thought, enveloping me in the gargantuan tentacles of my own delusion, telling me I am nothing, but I deserve to be everything.
Narcissistic personality disorder is a pseudoscientific Freudian Ouroboros of bullshit and contradiction, a superficial and useless category of vague concepts, symbiotically sustaining the shallow and stereotypical archetype of itself. And I identify with the label on a deeply personal and emotional level and consider it a key part of my identity as a human being. Hello and welcome to The Essay. It's your favorite naturally blonde biological human woman and friendly neighborhood pathological narcissist, back with a $25 gamer headset and more hot spicy takes on modern psychology. The word narcissism and the concept of what it means to be a narcissist derive from Narcissus, a character in Greek mythology whose story is one of how exaggerated self-grandeur will inevitably lead to one's untimely demise. Due to an obsessive refusal to turn away from the love he held for his own reflection, Narcissus was punished for his inability to recognize his delusion and confront reality. He rejected all romantic advances, being driven insane by his sense of superiority and deep conviction that the only valuable presence in his life was himself. Depending on the variation of the myth, this inability to separate from his intense, morally corrupting, all-consuming self-love either leads to Narcissus committing suicide, or simply withering away and eventually collapsing beside the spring in which he sees his image reflected, gazing into his own eyes, unable to tear away from his own perfection. This story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of uncritical emotional indulgence, stubborn independence, and the belief in unrealistic superiority. While some aspects of this tale are more reflective of the time period they developed under, such as the emphasis on romantic partnership and Narcissus' refusal of this apparently being a part of his moral questionability, not very woke if you ask me, or even the idea proposed by some that the story was partially derived from or heavily contributed to a periodic superstitious attitude around mirrors, it is still mostly reflective of our current social values. We reward selflessness and disparage individuals who consider themselves superior. And although Narcissus is portrayed as an emotionally unstable character, suffering from delusion and a disconnect from reality, the implication is always that his fate is self-induced, and his self-destruction would have been avoided if he'd just known not to be selfish, or had been able to somehow stop his emotional urges from overpowering him in such a way. The term narcissist implies an emotional immaturity, someone who bends unthinkingly to their own self-rewarding and animalistic desires with little thought for others. Often someone hiding an unstable self-image and deep insecurity behind a mask of obnoxious performative confidence and a cruel attitude towards others that even they often don't realize is a mere facade. A force of pure malevolence, a master of manipulation who utilizes shameless exploitation to achieve their obviously capitalist and normative goals, because success is objective and determined by whatever the hegemonically endowed and systematically powerful decide. This is not an accurate analysis of the human psyche, and I will be attempting to prove so. Because I am someone who developed traits typically considered narcissistic at an early age due to my trauma growing up as an autistic child, and I have lived with them for long enough to adequately debunk certain beliefs about the disorder.
I was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder when I was 8 years old. Later than most assigned male at birth, but still relatively early in my childhood. I was committed to a psychologist intended to help me improve my limited communicative abilities, who did incredible damage to my developing psyche and how I understood the world and interacted with it. She told me I had no empathy for others, and I would never be able to maintain stable relationships in my life until I learned to at least mask as normal. She made me spend what felt like hours going over laminated flashcards, showing cartoonish and uncanny exaggerated stock photos of facial expressions, and I knew what I was meant to think of all of them. I knew that the smiling girl was happy, and the frowning man was angry. But I could not bring myself to answer the way I knew this woman wanted me to. Although I knew the immediate answers to her questions, I also completely understood that she was right about me. I knew how I was supposed to react to social cues. I knew what people wanted from me. I'd been observing it my whole life, for fuck's sake, but my emotional responses to stimuli are artifice. I go through the motions of how a normal person is supposed to act, participating enthusiastically in the intricate web of social rules fabricated by the typical, but it is all superficial. When I see one of my friends crying, I feel nothing but neutral observation of the situation. When I say I'm sorry after hurting someone, it is nothing above a formality. I feel many things, but what I do feel is often far more complex than my limited vocabulary provides me with the ability to express. I do know that I almost never feel what I'm supposed to be feeling, and that the feelings of others tend to simply glide right over my head, entirely unnoticed unless I push myself, often to the point of physical pain, to force a normal reaction to my situation. And sometimes that doesn't even work. Sometimes I'm too tired to even look concerned. I look down at the picture in my hand. It's a crudely cut out, laminated stock photo of a bearded man shouting angrily. It's not much bigger than my palm, and the plastic sheen is peeling off at one of the corners. The woman is asking me how I think this man is feeling. I open my mouth and then close it, then open it again. I don't know.
Narcissistic personality disorder is pathologically characterized by a collection of intersecting traits, often overlapping with symptoms of OCD, paranoia, and antisocial personality disorder, APD, or psychopathy. It is generally understood to encompass symptoms such as a delusional self-image, difficulty forming emotional relationships or experiencing visceral empathy, emotional outbursts and disproportionate distress when faced with criticism, and overall an insecure and fragile sense of identity, which requires constant external validation. NPD is generally considered a very messy category, being removed altogether from the DSM-5 due to its controversial nature. The APA, or the American Psychiatric Association's description and definition of the disorder, as published in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 4th edition, or the DSM-4, was criticized extensively by clinicians as inadequately cataloging the range and complexity of NPD, resulting in a 3-year debate concluding in the ultimate decision that it was far too broad to be considered an individual disorder and was more accurately characterized as an umbrella term encompassing a variety of yet-to-be-determined more specific diagnoses. Originally, the topic of narcissism as a clinical diagnosis first started to attract interest in the growing school of thought known as psychoanalysis during the early 1900s. Austrian psychoanalyst Otto Rank published one of the earliest descriptions of narcissism in 1911, in which he once again connected the label to the image of excessive and irrational self-admiration and vanity, this time through a more pathological lens. In 1914, Sigmund Freud published a paper titled On Narcissism, an Introduction. Freud proposed that narcissism, along with literally everything else he studied, is connected to one's libido, and whether it is directed inward towards oneself or outward towards others. He believed that infants directed all of this libido inward, a state he referred to as primary narcissism. Freud also felt that such a state was normal within children, but would typically disappear or at least become more balanced into adulthood, thus establishing narcissism to be understood by many as a kind of emotionally developmental immaturity. Ignoring the fact that Freud's theories were exclusively based in his own baseless conclusions he derived from his singular perspective and had zero research or scientific studies to back them up, he was incredibly influential, and his theories unfortunately still dramatically affect how psychology is understood to this day. It is incredibly important to emphasize that the idea of narcissism as a psychological disorder is a very new concept, and one that arose from a culture that heavily stigmatizes narcissistic traits. The idea of narcissistic personality disorder was initially created to encompass a collection of behaviors that the general population considered bad and morally corrupt. With this in mind, we must ask ourselves whether this classification was forged with the best interests of those it sought to label in mind, or whether it was made more as a way to group together a selection of people expressing behaviors and inner struggles that were seen as biologically and ethically defective. To this day, the label of narcissist is still heavily debated by psychologists and diluted with baseless pseudoscience and ableist bias.
I am sitting in my room, staring at the screen of my iPod Touch, doom-scrolling through page after page of vague psychological jargon and meaningless buzzwords. My eyes burn from their proximity to the tiny screen, but I am too desperate to just give up and go to sleep. The sun will be up in less than 2 hours, and I feel as if I'm getting worse. I feel angry and agitated all the time, constantly paranoid and distrustful of the world around me. I know the people looking at me at school are jealous of me. They hate me and want to relish in my downfall and humiliation. The metaphysical colossal squid that used to soothe me feels like it's dragging me down into the dark depths of the icy ocean to drown. I screamed at a boy in my class yesterday. My outbursts of aggression and instability feel like they're getting more and more frequent. The boys at my school treat me like a joke. They follow me to see what bathroom I use. They try to pull down my skirt and expose me. They call me a queer and a tranny, and say I'm selfish and annoying. Selfish is a word that I'm used to. I've heard myself called that since I was younger than 11, but annoying cuts the deepest. I feel sick even thinking the word. I know they're right. I'm irrational, emotional, and loud. I'm constantly and obsessively focusing on my own ideas and knowledge, and I find myself physically unable to imagine feelings that differ from my own. I have resigned myself to self-identifying as an asshole, as if acknowledging and labeling it makes it any better. But I know it's more than that. No one with this much of a raging main character complex could possibly just be a bad person, right? What even is a bad person? Do bad people consider themselves such? Do bad people even know that other people would consider them such? I should definitely go to sleep.
When seeking out neutral sources of information on narcissism, published resources almost always default towards informing those assumedly neurotypical within proximity to someone with a disorder, using intentionally dehumanizing language that gives the perceived narc an air of what is almost bizarre mysticism, and merely seeking to teach innocent neurotypicals how to deal with us, rather than trying to provide any direct help with our own delusions and struggles. It is eerily similar to how many people talk about developmental or behavioral disorders such as autism, preferring to simply isolate and avoid neurodeviance and treat it as a threat to be combated by those who meet societal expectations, over the more difficult option of openly questioning hierarchical systems of ingrained ableism and attempting to better understand and help those who are different in ways we find challenging. Growing up as an autistic child, I found my own needs and feelings more often than not overshadowed by the difficulty my presence posed to others, usually being taught to mask my autistic traits instead of being accommodated for, which resulted in anxiety around adults and authority figures that persists to this day. Although we are gradually improving with education on how to properly treat autistic people, I find these experiences eerily reminiscent to how we as a society treat personality disorders like NPD. More often than not, when the label is utilized, it serves the purpose of tabulating a series of traits in an external object that a hypothetical neurotypical person could potentially fall victim to, rather than genuinely labeling and understanding a type of neurodivergence for the sake of the people experiencing it. Narcissist, meaning abusive monster, and narcissist, meaning a person with NPD, are separate but inevitably interwoven and almost symbiotic. Narcissistic traits were first recognized and documented as bad person traits long before they were medicalized, and the diagnostic criteria for narcissistic personality disorder was established with a preconceived understanding of morality and the connotations of the word narcissistic attributed by our cultural understanding of virtue and empathy. Thus, we must acknowledge the inherent flaws these circumstances of discovery lend to the category of the narcissist. The way we classify personality disorders is usually not so much based on a placeable imbalance in the human brain than on our biased perceptions of divergence from hegemony and an intense desire to group and understand variant traits for the sake of more efficient subjugation and dismissal. Within the field of psychology, like all sciences, our understanding of phenomena is not objectively neutral. What we decide to focus on meticulously dissecting and understanding, what we consider deviance and what we consider standard, what the culturally valuable fields are, and whether the Earth is round, are all questions whose answers have shifted drastically over time. As much as we would like it to be so, nothing is completely apolitical. Psychiatry is not a neutral institution of objective knowledge, and the pathologization of divergence from hegemonic expectations is simply another way for the status quo to integrate itself as an unquestioned aspect of our supposed reality. By framing disobedience to it as illness, as an inherent flaw or brokenness that needs fixing by the same institutions maintaining the widespread acceptance of this understanding, they keep us subdued and subjugated. There's a lot of long sentences in this shit, holy shit. Personality disorders, while being labeled groups of scientifically documented traits, are still politically charged categories and not unworthy of question. The statistical evidence heavily supports the shifting of which disorders are more likely to be attributed to which groups over time, showing that there's more going on than a simple unbiased assessment of a person's psychological traits. Disorders like bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder are more frequently diagnosed in women, and arguably the predecessor of BPD, histrionic personality disorder, or HPD, is essentially categorized by an exaggerated display of stereotypical hysterical femininity, and is again discussed almost exclusively from the point of view of men who may find themselves in proximity to people with said disorder. In his book Psychiatric Hegemony, A Marxist Theory on Mental Illness, Bruce M.Z. Cohen writes on BPD, "Seen as a milder form of schizophrenia, and laying on the borderline between neurosis and psychosis, the concept has been used in psychiatry since 1938. Like other personality disorders, BPD has a notoriously low reliability level, even by the generally poor standards of the DSM, and even within the profession is considered by many as yet another wastebasket category, though as Bourne so ruefully remarks, the ambiguity of such disorders makes them particularly useful in policing deviance in the new century." I think that the same can very easily be said of NPD. The concept of NPD was not coined in an attempt to understand and help people whose minds function in different ways, but to identify and hegemonize those of atypical morality. The human tendency to desperately control and mediate nonconformity through superficial categorization has devastating effects, and while many narcs find it validating to be provided with a third-party pathological diagnosis that explains the ways in which they differ from the norm, the label was not created to do such a thing. From both the way narcissistic personality disorder is discussed socially and within psychology, it is clear to me that it was merely coined as another way to associate equitably poor morality with neurodivergent people in order to dehumanize them. The narcissist is seen as an unfeeling force of abuse and emotional violence, a morally depraved puppet master of manipulation incapable of love. It is fear-mongering bigotry at its finest, spinning a narrative where narcissists are seen almost as monsters or mythical cryptids, rather than people who simply experience the world differently than what is considered valuable and respectable. None of the studies on narcissism were written or even assessed by someone with the diagnosis who has lived with the very experiences being studied. Hell, the concept was incredibly influenced, if not formulated originally, by the notoriously incorrect Sigmund Freud, and as we all know, all of his theories were incredibly rational and scientifically backed, and were not just projections of his own bizarre conclusions onto the general public, and a tragic inability to recognize his own neurodeviance.
I have always liked taking time alone. Overall, I'm just not a very social person. I love spending time with my friends, but the constant creeping distrust I feel for others drains me of energy. I understand myself, I know what I need and how I feel. When I'm alone, I'm in control, and I can adequately assess whatever situations I find myself in. I've taken to indulging in self-appointed periods of disengagement with other people to help mediate my outbursts. I don't want to hurt anyone, but my mind seems to be operating on two separate wavelengths, and one of them is constantly screaming at me to prove my superiority, telling me to retaliate with violence at any sliver of negative attention it perceives, even just a neutral glance from a stranger. Oftentimes I can ignore this, pushing it to the back of my mind and going through the motions of normality as best I can manage. However, this can only build up for so long, and I become a ticking time bomb, ready to unleash rage at a moment's provocation. So detox periods of reconstructing my fragile stability alone in my room, or down at the river in the bush near my house, are incredibly necessary. I can hear my mom crying outside my door. My ears are ringing from her shout of, "What the fuck is wrong with you?" I can feel that my face is completely blank and expressionless, but painful knots of shame and disgust twist in my stomach, and I feel my head swimming with nausea and dizziness. I wish I could show my family something, anything but blind rage, to prove that I care about them. But I feel as if I'm paralyzed. I feel as if I'm standing on a thin pane of glass suspended over a sprawling abyss of nothingness. I feel like if I move a muscle, I will crack and unleash the hatred bubbling up inside of me. I keel over as I'm hit by another wave of nausea, pulling the blanket over my head to drown out my mother's muffled sobs.
Narcissism isn't a real thing. It's an attempt at labeling a category of the population as undesirably evil and almost subhuman. While real things, so to speak, are obviously not easy to label, especially in our current dystopian state of technology rapidly blurring the line between artificial simulation and tangible physicality, I am very afraid. Narcissism is not a physical imbalance or genetic deviation in any manner that we know of, and is more or less essentially a complete social construct. Shit isn't real. Something that held the potential to be a useful category to name and better understand a recognizable type of person, instead has become a way for us to yet again dehumanize and demonize those who defy social expectation. The very existence of concepts like narcissistic abuse or cluster B abuse make the intention behind these classifications incredibly apparent. With the pathologization of morality, there arises quite a few questions regarding the very essence of what it means to be a bad or good person. The easy answer is obviously that such a distinction is defined by one's choices, and whether or not a person makes a conscious effort to always do the right thing, but the world we live in is not an equal playing field. For those who experience delusions, paranoia, or anxiety, their perception of moral correctness can be easily warped and impossible to accurately discern. I know that for most of my life since becoming aware of my NPD, I have spent a lot of time mistrusting my own confidence, being afraid to speak my mind in case my opinions on a situation are being formulated by my delusions, or refusing self-advocacy out of the possibility that I am unknowingly hurting people while completely believing I'm in the right. Many people with OCD and intrusive thoughts struggle on a daily basis with picturing horrific acts of violence and sexual deviancy, and often these thoughts are so vivid they are impossible to simply ignore. Other people still struggle with communication and are unable to properly express their needs and input in ways that are deemed appropriate. Some people experience trauma that leads them to become emotionally caged, distrusting, and defensive. Some people are seen as inherently more threatening due to their ethnicity, background, or identity, without doing anything to indicate that they are not worthy of trust. All of these people, and really anyone who is incompatible with the status quo, will have to work considerably harder in order to meet the threshold of acceptable social behavior than those who are automatically granted acceptance and trust. No mental state is inherently worse off ethically. No thoughts are immoral. While a person's actions and their treatment of those around them are obviously their individual responsibility, and mental illness isn't an excuse for repeated cruelty towards others, it is important to acknowledge the nuance of things like kindness and empathy, which are often considered more black and white than they really are. In reality, it's not always as easy as just try to be nicer. For some people that's enough, but for others they will need to constantly monitor themselves, and what they say and think, spend hours alone to self-mediate their anger levels, or even physically hurt themselves to refrain from lashing out at others. I am not denying that people diagnosed with NPD have probably been abusive, cruel, manipulative, etc. Statistically, with how many human beings currently roam the earth, this is obviously true. But the instant association of personality disorders, particularly cluster B disorders, with abuse makes me question the practical utility of these labels. The factors that contribute to a person's treatment of others are vast and nuanced. NPD was coined to basically label people as clinical assholes, with little care being given to how this may affect the wide range of people who meet its vague diagnostic criteria. The way NPD is talked about casually, outside of a clinical setting, treats it simply as a way for us to willingly see people who hurt us, for unknown reasons, as unfeeling forces of pure evil and strip them of their humanity and psychological intricacy, dismissing them as beyond and undeserving of compassion in any form. We are either a freak show exhibit or a disgusting evil monster with no in-between, and any semblance of compassion we are tossed comes in the form of condescending superiority and performative sympathy. There is so much wrong with how psychology is practiced currently, and the NPD label is yet another example of the human condition being jammed into neat, razor-sharp little boxes that it will never effectively fit into without destructive exclusion. All of this is completely true, and yet I still somewhat openly call myself a narcissist. From an early age, I was very hyper-aware of the ways in which I was different, despite being usually unable to directly recognize my delusions when I was experiencing them. My narcissistic traits began earlier than typically documented, and I can remember showing excessive irrational behavior at a much larger scale than my peers even before I started high school. These traits were a direct aspect of my ASD, my struggles with connection and lack of empathy being present due to autism since forever, and developing into what is typically considered narcissism due to my difficulty connecting with my peers as I grew older. Because of this, and my paranoia and trust issues that formed because of being heavily monitored in school, I meet every diagnostic criteria for NPD, despite their admittedly vague nature. And I willingly choose to openly identify as someone with NPD. Sure, I don't discuss it with just anyone, and I don't bring it up casually due to how stigmatized the disorder is, but I have no issue with calling myself a pathological narcissist despite the connotations. The NPD diagnosis relieved me of so much tension and day-to-day anxiety I was experiencing, and although it took me years to openly tell even my parents when I first became aware that this disorder most likely described me, I distinctly remember the sense of admittedly bittersweet relief when I found out that there was a concrete name for what I am. Like almost literally everyone with the disorder, my narcissism is not as neatly measured and packaged as the DSM-4 definition would like. I exhibit traits of both malignant narcissism and compensatory narcissism, and my NPD heavily overlaps with my ASD and OCD. Probably more accurately represented for me personally as the middle of a Venn diagram between the two. I would generally agree with the revision provided in the DSM-5 that it is more of a collection of overlapping traits that vary heavily from person to person than a narrow individual category itself. However, I do undeniably meet the criteria described and would by all definitions be considered a pathological narcissist. At the time when I concluded my initial research and discovered the label, I was 14 and had a much less nuanced and critical view of the way psychology is practiced. Yes, I was researching pathological narcissism at the age of 14. I was a very normal child, thank you for asking. And while now I am incredibly cynical towards the way personality disorders are appointed, I don't deny myself that initial rush of validation. I believe that on a wider scale, abolition of the category, or at least distinctively emphasizing its status as a very vague umbrella, is a good thing. However, I believe that before we are equipped to properly critique, reevaluate, and reconstruct our psychological classifications, we must destigmatize them and become able to openly discuss them properly, and help those who are encompassed by such descriptions without guilting or shaming them into conformity.